Well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. We're at 6:05. I'll keep an eye on the letting people in, and we'll go ahead and get started. So hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight for EcoQuestions. This is being recorded, and we ask that everyone remain muted until it's time for our Q&A. During the presentation, feel free to type questions into the chat, and we'll address those at the appropriate time. Everyone who has registered for this session will receive a recording in their email, and it will also be available on our YouTube channel. For those of you who are not familiar with the Metro Phoenix EcoFlora, we are a community science project that is documenting urban biodiversity using a free web-based platform and app called iNaturalist. It's a lot of fun. It can help you identify things that you don't know. And every month, in addition to the overall project, we have a new EcoQuest challenge, and this looks for certain species or ecological interactions and relationships. And each month we have EcoQuestion sessions that are focused on the subject of the EcoQuest. So May is National Wildfire Awareness Month, and together EcoFlora and the Central Arizona Conservation Alliance are working to raise awareness and provide opportunities to learn about wildfire. So we have a bunch of virtual events planned, a series of virtual events with local experts like Kara here tonight, and a series of blog posts filled with info. And you can follow along with us on social media all month long to learn more about wildfire. Anya is the engagement coordinator for CASCA, and she should be here a little bit later, so she'll be joining us as well. In coordination with our May EcoQuest Up in Flames, which is documenting invasive plant species that fuel wildfire, we have Kara Barron, the Science and Outreach Manager at the Gila Watershed Partnership in Safford, Arizona. Kara graduated from Arizona State University in 2018 with a master's degree in plant biology and conservation, where she studied the impact of wildfire and restoration on plant community composition of the Arizona Upland subdivision of the Sonoran Desert. That is a mouthful, but very impressive. Tonight, she's going to talk with us about how Sonoran Desert plant communities respond to wildfire, how some individual plants respond, and how a future with more frequent wildfires can alter the plant community composition altogether. Thank you, and welcome, Kara.
Sorry about that. I muted myself and couldn't figure out how to unmute me for a moment there. Thanks. Thank you, Jenny. All right, let me share my screen again here. There we go. All right, thank you very much for being here, everybody. Like Jenny said, my name is Kara Barron, and I am the Science and Outreach Manager at Gila Watershed Partnership. When I was at ASU, I studied how fire and reseeding affect Arizona upland plant community composition. And to get started, let's talk a little bit about where the Arizona upland is. So for those of you who aren't aware, the Sonoran Desert actually has subdivisions. There are 7 recognized subdivisions that have slightly different plant communities, and 2 of those occur in Arizona. And one of them is the Lower Colorado Valley, and the other one is the Arizona Upland. And Arizona Upland is upland, so it's a little higher in elevation than the Colorado Valley, and about 2,000 feet in elevation and above. So northeast of Phoenix and the mountain parks there is typically considered Arizona Upland. And of course, the entire Sonoran Desert has saguaro, so that is a dominant species in the Arizona upland as well, but a co-dominant species is Palo Verde, and typically it is the little leaf Palo Verde or Parkinsonia microphylla. So the Sonoran Desert, not fire adapted. So what does that mean, right? So when a plant community is fire adapted, plants have traits that respond positively to fire. So things like their seed bank may include seeds that respond to smoke, being exposed to smoke by germinating. There are some conifers that the cones do not open unless they've been exposed to fire or heat. And then another trait that might be fire adapted would be the ability to resprout from roots after a fire comes through. So in our Sonoran Desert, that is not typically the case. Most of our plants don't have these abilities. And historically, plants are spread out enough that wildfire typically doesn't carry. So historically, even if fires do start, which of course they do, monsoon seasons carry lightning with them, and fires do happen in the desert, but they typically don't carry very far and they don't burn very hot. So with the influx of humans into this part of the United States, into our desert Southwest, we bring with us lots of things. And we bring with us things like our vehicles, our plants, our agriculture, livestock, etc. We change the landscape. You know, that's just inherently what we do. That's just part of the deal. So we have a changing fire regime in the Sonoran Desert, and it is at least in part because of humans. So this little graphic here gives you an idea. Like I said, historically, plants are spaced pretty far apart so fires don't carry. Now, things like vehicle emissions and agricultural runoff, etc., can cause nitrogen deposition. So the soils tend to have a little more nutrient deposition, so more nutrients available in the soils now that we inhabit here. And while nutrients can be a good thing, they can also, you know, a little bit is a good thing maybe, but too much can, overindulgence can be a bad thing, right? So you combine that with a wet winter, and we see those spaces between plants getting filled in by wildflowers. Now that's all great, but with some of the plants that we bring in with us, some of them invasive, we are, you know, again, filling in those gaps. Things dry out, we go through a drought, we have all that fuel. And that fuel will carry fires further, and sometimes it makes them burn hotter depending on the species. And we are basically changing the landscape even more inadvertently. So when I was at ASU, I wanted to study how this was affecting plant communities, which species were being affected. And I also wanted to know a little bit more about how restoration might affect that. So when wildfires blow through the Sonoran Desert or any desert system, because they're not fire adapted, the seed bank can be destroyed. It also reduces native perennial cover, and I forgot the third thing I was going to say. I'm sure I'll remember it in a minute. But one of the things that that I wanted to bring up right now is that they can destroy the soil seed bank. So reseeding may be an effective way to help facilitate recovery, but there are some mixed results about that. So my questions for my research were: which species are present at study sites? How do fire and reseeding affect community attributes such as diversity and cover? And are there any significant differences in distribution of cover between treatments for individual species or growth habits? So when I talk about significant difference of distribution of cover, I'm basically wondering, are there species that are doing, that have greater cover in the burn area versus the adjacent unburned area? Or is there a growth habit such as shrubs or trees that do better or worse significantly between burn and unburn? So I'll start with talking about the work that I did at the McDowell Sonoran Preserve. So at the McDowell Sonoran Preserve, In the 90s, there were several fires, and 3 of these were study sites for me. And they are on this map here in orange. For those of you who are not familiar with McDowell Sonoran Preserve, this is located in the Northeast Valley. You can see Paradise Valley to the southwest there. So one of the study sites was the Granite Fire. That was in 1992. That area is about 2,400 square feet in elevation and about 2,000 acres burned. The second fire I studied was the Rio Fire. This was a fire that happened in 1995, and it was a very big fire that came partially onto the McDowell Sonoran Preserve, and it burned about 5,000 acres there. Again, that area is about 2,400 feet in elevation as well. And the third and final study site for this research was done in the south part of the park, or of the preserve. That was the Ancala Fire that started in 1993, and it burned about 250 acres. And the elevation there is about 1,900 feet. Okay, so what we did, and I say we because I had a lot of help, and I will never forget them, and I am so grateful. So I'm just going to already throw that out there. I couldn't have done this by myself. So what we did is we set up 2 100-meter transects at each site, one in an area that had been burned and one in an adjacent unburned area. And along that transect, we placed 10 plots. The plots were 78.5 meters squared, and there was a subplot within each that was 1 meter squared. So what did we do there? So we took measurements in 2016 and 2017, fall 2016, I should say, and spring 2017 to catch annuals that might be fall annuals versus spring annuals. We measured diversity by seeing which species were there. So species richness, how many species were present. And then I used the Sorensen dissimilarity matrix to see how similar the diversity was comparing the two treatments. We also measured cover. So that's how much cover the plants had in each plot versus bare ground. So we measured the cover of perennials in the entire plot, and then that little subplot that you see there measured annual cover as well as small perennials. So if I mention the word significant difference, what I'm saying is that statistically speaking, I have 95% confidence that the findings were significantly different. So that's using statistical analysis. I won't say that otherwise. So what do we find? So looking at species richness, again, how many species were at our sites, you can see the orange is burned, the burned transects. The control is the unburned adjacent, and then I also just counted overall how many species were in both plots and add them together. So you can see that at all 3 sites, there wasn't a huge difference in how many species were there between treatments. And at the granite site, we even had more species in the burn rather than the control. And all of these fires were at least 20 years old by the time we studied them. Overall, I mean, 94 species overall, and in the burned areas, 95 species in the unburned areas. So we were really seeing that diversity, or species richness at least, was was comparable. So looking at this Sorensen diversity index, what this actually measured is how dissimilar instead of similar the sites were, or I should say the treatments were from each other. And so like take Ancala, for instance, 0.250 is the number you see there. So basically what this is telling us is that the burned plot and the unburned plots were 75% similar, about 25% dissimilar as far as species are concerned. Now, Sorensen Diversity Index takes that number and will tell us whether that's due to turnover or nestedness. And when we talk about nestedness, basically, if most of that dissimilarity was attributed to nestedness, we would assume that there was more recovery that needed to happen at the burn site. If most of the dissimilarity is due to turnover, that tells us that most likely we're seeing that the burn site now is recovered, most likely, but it's just showing a different suite of species if they're dissimilar. And so as you can see at all three sites, they are fairly similar to each other. Actually, Ancala was the one that was the least similar at being 75%. And most of that is due to turnover. So basically what it's telling us is we just have different suites of species now. The species composition is slightly changed. So looking at cover, basically, again, we're seeing, burn is in orange, unburned is in blue, very similar in cover as well. There was really no significant differences between the two. But that changes a little bit when we look at growth habit and individual species. So there were two growth forms that stood out as being significantly different between burned and unburned plots. And that was the subshrubs, which are those shrubs that don't get woody. So brittle-bush would be considered a subshrub. And succulents, and that includes our cacti. And what we found was that the subshrubs are significantly greater in the burn plots, and succulents are significantly decreased in the burn plots. Not necessarily completely a surprise, right? So looking at specific species, there were some species that actually significantly increased with fire. And one of them was a small annual called Duscarania pinnata. The other three were Acacia gregii, Ancilia farinosa, and Senecovesii. So that's catclaw acacia, brittlebush, and desert senna. Sometimes people call that one rattlesnake weed. Now, when we look at the opposite, species with this significant decline in cover post-fire, that list is a bit longer. Now, what I find particularly interesting about this is 9 of these species are wildflowers, or annuals, if you will. Crasella cannata, Draba cunifolia, Logphia arizonica, Parataria hespera, Pecticaria heterocarpa, and platycarpa, and recurvata for that matter. Phacelia distans, Philistema auratum are all wildflowers. So basically, 20 years post-fire, species richness, overall cover, good to go. But subshrubs have greater cover, and the succulents have a significantly reduced cover. And individually, there's something going on with the annuals. All right, so I'm gonna switch gears now, and I'm gonna take you over to Cave Creek Regional Park, where there was a small fire and then a reseeding that was done. So Cave Creek Regional Park is a little bit further north and a few miles further west than the McDowell Sonoran Preserve, but still in Arizona upland. There was a fire in 2005 that started at the south part of the park, just outside of the southern boundary on private property. It only burned about 4 acres. And there's a little circle there, if you see that at the south. So the restoration or the reseeding was done by Northern Arizona University crew, and they were headed up by Scott Abella. They hydroseeded 28 species into this burned area, and they monitored it for 3 years. And here in the orange, you can see that is where the fire was. The green is the boundary of the park. So for this study site, they reseeded the area within the park, but there is land, the private land south of that, there was some monitoring done a little bit post-fire, and that's where those plots were. Okay, so similar methods to McDowell Sonoran Preserve, but it was a little bit different. Scott Abella and his team originally only cared to study which species that they had seeded were coming up. So they had 22 plots within the reseeded area that they were keeping track of, and in order to see which species were coming up. But then later on, they added 50-meter transects instead of 100-meter transects like we saw at the other study site. So there were 5 plots in the burn area on the private land. And because that area was small, it couldn't really be a whole lot bigger than that. And then they put another transect in the adjacent unburned area to study. Again, same size plots with that sub plot in the middle. Same measurements were taken. This was just done in spring of 2017 though. So species richness, we looked at dissimilarity, we looked at cover of perennials within the entire plot, and measured annuals and small perennials within the subplot. So because we had so many plots in the seeded area, I took a random sample of 5 and I used that to do the statistical analysis. And we found, again, you can see that as far as species richness goes, the burned area was had less species richness than the other 2, but not by a whole lot. And overall, there were 56 species found. When looking at the diversity index, I compared unburned to burn, burned to seeded, and seeded to unburned. And basically what I found is that the burn and unburned were the 2 that were the least, they were the most dissimilar, if you will. And most of that, again, even it's 12 years post-fire, 48% of that 50 was attributed to turnover. So different suite of species coming up. Comparing the burn to the seeded, a little bit more similar. Again, different suite of species. Same with seeded and unburned. Those were the 2 that were most similar. And still, different suite of species we're looking at. So there was some nestedness value, so there's probably still some recovery going on. But overall, they're at a point where there's just mostly a different plant community composition going on. Looking at cover, there were definitely some differences in cover. As you can see, the burn plots had an average of about 7% cover, where the unburned or control area had more like 17% cover, and the seeded area was more like an average of 12. When looking specifically at growth habits, we see some interesting things happening. So in this, a little bit different from McDowell Sonoran Preserve, in that the annuals were actually significantly greater in the burn plot. The subshrubs were significantly greatest in the reseeded plots, and the shrubs and the succulents were significantly greater in the control plots or the unburned plots. So again, succulents are suffering, if you will. Maybe suffering isn't the right word to use, but they're definitely impacted significantly by the fire. So I'm sure a lot of you are curious which seeded species came up. So they seeded 28 species, and 11 of them established populations post-fire. The 3 that are bolded are actually not found anywhere else in the park. And that's Atriflex canescens, Phacelia crenulata, and Sphaeralsia ambigua, and that is the subspecies that has the purple flowers. So they were really easy to point out. That was that was nice. All right, so species with significantly greater cover in the burn treatment. Again, annuals stood out here, including Bromus rubens, Docus pusillus, Hordeum marinum, and Oncocyphon pulluliferum, Plantago patagonica, Pictocarya heterocarpa, and Schismus barbatus. Now, those of you that are familiar with desert annuals may notice that most of these are what we would say are non-native, and Onchocyphum palluliferum is now on the Arizona noxious weed list. So it's an interesting finding. In our unburned plots, there was 2 species that were significantly greater, and that's Ambrosia Deltoidia and Vulpia octiflora, which is an annual grass. So basically, we have, again, decreased species richness at the burn, significantly greater cover of annuals in this particular spot, and especially the Onchocyphum palluliferum. I will tell you, I don't have a picture of it here, but during one of my treks out there, I came out covered in yellow from all the pollen, and that was mostly from that Onchocyphum. Overall, so as far as the reseeding, there was increased diversity. It was not necessarily significant, but there was definitely some increased diversity there. It was definitely more similar to the unburned treatment than the burned was. The overall perennial cover was greater than in the burned treatment. Subshrub cover, again, significantly increased in the reseeded area. And in this particular instance, reseeding does seem to facilitate recovery. Now, can we say that definitely? No, but it does seem to be, at least anecdotally, doing what it's intended to do for this particular site. So long-term fire effects for Arizona uplands. As we all know, fires are increasing in frequency, and as my studies show, composition is changing. For better or for worse, it's changing. Subshrubs significantly favored in burn treatments, and they may be, at least temporarily, on a plant scale, maybe not on a human scale, replacing succulent growth habits. But I would like to make a note that if fires are occurring more often than succulents are able to recover, we may lose some of our succulents. Things like barrel cacti and saguaros take anywhere from 20 to 50 years in order to begin to be of a reproductive age. So if we're having fires occur every 5 or 10 years in certain areas, we may lose species like saguaro and barrel cacti in those places. Again, anecdotally, at this particular site, 11 species from the seeded mix, established populations. Reseeding may be facilitating recovery here, and maybe keeping noxious weeds at bay. So it's something to think about. There are many factors that, besides just seeds, that affect the success of reseeding, but it's something to keep in mind, I think. So with that, I will acknowledge all of the people that helped me do this, because yes, it was many, many people, many hands. So I appreciate all of them. Some sources, and I can share these with you later if you aren't able to get a screenshot of this before I pass it by. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kara. All right, we're going to move into our Q&A session. So I'm going to read the questions from the chat first. And this is a question that we really hear a lot is, when these areas burn, why don't we do something? Can we immediately go out there and reseed? And I think that's, another really important part of the study that you did is showing, what that could look like possibly in areas. And our first question kind of relates to that. Are brittlebush and desert marigold 2 of the best native desert plants to reseed with?
So I don't know if they're the best, but I know that they are early, what we call early sterile species. So when a fire affected area starts to recover, those species tend to be some of the first ones that appear. So it does not hurt to have them in a mix if they, especially, and you want to, if they commonly occur in the area, I would say, yes, go for it. If you're in an area where they don't commonly occur, which is probably unlikely, then maybe think about what does. But I would say preliminarily, without seeing what site it is, most likely, yeah.
I think another good one is the Ambrosia Deltoidia, so the bursage. That's a really good nurse plant that we've seen. So that could be a really helpful one too. And this brings up a lot of, other questions about, genetics and where do you get seed from and all those kinds of things. And we'll be going into that in one of our blog posts with Kazka. But, we just don't have a lot of native plant material or seed here, which is something that I know you've worked on, Kara, and Anya is here with us too,
Yes.
with Kazka, and we're all working on that. So just let everyone know, it's not like we can just go run and grab a whole bunch of bags of seed and go out there and help. It's, we need those resources as well. So then,
Yes.
sorry, go ahead, Kara.
Oh, no, for sure. Yeah. That is something that we've all been working on for quite a few years, is especially now that wildfires are becoming a little more prevalent, a little more widespread, happening more often. If we want to get seed out on the land, where are we taking it from? And we don't want to decimate wild populations, right? We want it to be appropriate too. Desert marigold may grow in Albuquerque, but is that something that we want to put out? And I don't know if that's true actually, but but is that something that we want to put? If that's a higher elevation place, is it gonna do well in our lower elevation Sonoran Desert? So those are things that we have to be very careful of.
Right. So throwing things in the mix that may not have been there before in the first place before the burn.
Yeah, and also it may be that if it's not from an appropriate place, you may be wasting your money. You may be putting out seed that isn't going to germinate and isn't going to do well. So in order to increase your chances of successful reseeding, having locally adapted plants has been showing more and more to be key.
Great. We also have a question for clarification. What exactly is meant by turnover versus nestedness? I think we want a little bit more clarity on that.
Yeah, so nestedness is basically if the nestedness value was the dominant or the higher value, what that would indicate is that the area is still in recovery and probably doesn't, it is probably still going to have more, gosh, how do I put this? Gotta find the right words. Think of it like those nesting dolls. You have one it means that there's still more seeds and more recovery to be done. So versus at this point, if the value skews more toward the turnover, basically what that is telling us is the species that aren't there that were in the other plots probably aren't going to be there in the future. Does that make more sense?
Karen, you can unmute if you would like to.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I don't understand the concept of nestedness. I can figure out turnover, but are you?
So it's like a subset of all the species that could be there. So if there's still just a subset of species in that area, then it would be nested within the other area. Does that make sense?
So are you saying that these plants that are nested are the ones who came back? The ones that were there before and then came back, those are considered nested?
Yes.
Okay. I'm just looking for a real basic definition of what you're talking about. Because
yeah, and not necessarily that they were the ones that came back. So there are a lot of similar species in the burned area that are also in the unburned area, but there's enough of a difference in species that it's turnover. It's isn't just that what is in the burned area is a subset of what's in the unburned area. It's also got species in it that aren't in the burned area or aren't in the unburned area at all.
Meaning new species could have moved in.
New species moved into the burned area that aren't showing up in the unburned area.
Okay, so that would fall under turnover.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
But under nested, you're only talking about species that
were a subset of what
typically
occurs.
there before.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
It's okay. Well, I figured it had to be something fairly basic, but it wasn't clear. So
yeah.
All right, thank you.
I'm never good with math, so that's helpful. We have another question. Has this research had an impact on any ongoing conservation/restoration projects in the area it was done in?
Well, I know that it was helpful to the McDowell Sonoran Conservancy and some of their, they've done some studies and I know they've kind of looked at my findings, but I think one of the biggest things that we can get out of it, I don't know exactly to what extent people are using this information at this point, and that I find most interesting, honestly, is the individual species. Like, which species are coming back? Which species do we need to give a little more help to, right? Maybe what needs a little bit more research. Like, in my opinion, I think looking at wildflowers and there were a lot of wildflowers that had a significant decrease in cover in the burned areas. Now, as a growth form, that isn't the case, but wildflowers make up more than 50% of the diversity in the Sonoran Desert. So it would take a lot of those species to be affected for that to show up as part of that growth form decrease. But there's enough diversity in wildflowers that I think we might want to look at that a little bit more. So there's definitely some questions to be answered still.
I think a good thing to note is, this research in itself is so valuable because we don't have a lot of research pertaining to fire in the Sonoran Desert. There's a lot of opportunity now to get in there and do a lot with these mega fires that are happening back to back, especially. And I really hope that people do. And, it's something that we need more information on. So like I said before, it makes your research even more valuable for the time.
And I also want to give a plug here to baseline data. So there are projects like the Plant Atlas Project of Arizona and different floristic inventories that are being done in our mountain parks, and more of that needs to be done, because if we don't know what was there prior to the fire, it's a little bit harder to understand what changed. So having that baseline data and having more volunteers or more people willing to go out and gather that data would be extremely helpful. So just a plug for that.
And that's something EcoFlora could help with.
Yeah.
Ideally. That was another kind of question that I was going to ask you, because people always say, what can we do to help, right? How can we pitch in? And you and I talked about that, thinking of floras and more research. And like you said, just getting out there and finding what's there, and preparing for future events, right? And preventing wildfires is another big one. So keeping them from happening in the first place.
And it looks like Anya might.
Go ahead, Anya.
Hi, everybody. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt, so I just, Zoom tools. Hi, everybody. I wanted to shamelessly plug on June 17th, we're actually going to be hosting precisely a presentation on the update for the White Tank Mountains Floristic Inventory. We had our trained budding botanist just complete that work after starting in 2016. And I'm just about to finish typing up the information in the chat. So anyone interested can register for that event. But we're very excited to see the differences that Cass Blodgett and Don Goldman have been able to find comparing to the last one that was done over 50 years ago now, or close to 50 years ago. So precisely that, looking at the incursion of invasive plant species and how the park has changed over time. Really important stuff. But yeah, I will put that information in the chat. And amazing work, Kara. Great job.
Thanks.
Thanks, Anya. Thank you for putting that information in the chat for everybody. Do you know if any parts of the white tanks, I'm sure possibly were burned where they were doing that inventory?
I'm pretty sure that there's been burns in the past. I'm not sure that there were any recent, but I remembered, I want to say that I was talking to Cass, and there is an area there that is, I believe, jojoba dominated. And the jojoba actually, I think what happened is there was some really good rains post-fire, and it's actually jojoba dominated now, which is interesting.
Yeah. We have another question in the chat. Your research showed increased cover of desert senna, catclaw acacia, and brittlebush at one site. Do these plants have something in common that makes them successful post-fire?
Desert senna and brittlebush are early sorrel species, so they do come into those disturbed areas, and they were able to get in there before I think any real invasive species did. So that's why they were there. Acacia greggii has the ability to resprout, I believe, so that could be at least part of the reason that it was successful.
Yeah, it's really interesting to go out and see where parts of the fires are in the McDowell Preserve, because you can definitely tell they're kind of dominated by that catclaw acacia, some jojoba, and you see no saguaro, no ocotillo, versus the unburned area. So seeing what kind of can resprout and come back is really interesting. Anya has put that information in the chat for everybody for the White Tank Mountain Flora updates. So I have another question. What part of your study did you find the most interesting or surprising?
Those wildflowers, for sure. That's, to be honest, that is really what I was interested in. I went into this trying to help develop a priority species list for the Sonoran Desert, because we really don't have one when it comes to which species should we put in, or we didn't at the time anyways. I believe that's changed now. At least in part, there has been some work on that, but I was really interested in finding out if there were any species that we needed to focus on for native plant materials development. And yeah, I have done quite a bit of work with wildflower studies, et cetera, while I was doing my graduate work. And those wildflowers, man, there are so many of them, and they are, they're incredible how they can lay dormant in the soil for years and years. And then one year, we get a flush, depending on when the rains came, of the desert hyacinth, or the poppies, or what have you, depending on the year. So they've always been really interesting to me. So it was surprising to see that even after so many years, some of them were still significantly changed as far as cover goes.
And I noticed on one of the slides that you had with red brome and stinknet and looked like a Mediterranean grass, those were the ones that moved in post-fire in that area, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Oncocyphon, Cave Creek was, I think, your North Phoenix area was some of the first hardest hit with that Oncocyphon invasion, if you will. And yeah, when back in 2016, 2017, when I was doing this work, that particular spring, Oncocyphon was thick in those study sites, unfortunately, especially in the burned areas.
So that's another thing for any of you out there, if you're interested in, we need more information about what those invasive species are doing post-fire. So that's really interesting to see in, your study, we see that, but I haven't found a whole lot of research, focused specifically on invasives moving back in or, post-fire. I think Juanita Armstrong at Maricopa County Parks had said that, some mustards were just going to town after fire, and they're way bigger in those burned areas because they've got access to those nutrients. So there's a lot to be learned about invasives and fire. So we really could use that information. Does anyone else have any other questions? Feel free to unmute or raise your hand. Okay, well, we're gonna play a game really quick. Kara, I have a few different burned species that I'm gonna show you, and
This should be fun.
would like to guess which ones they are. And
Oh
there
gosh,
we
I hope you
go.
made them easy.
All right, first one. Okay, this is technically scorched, so it's not completely burned.
That looks like probably Palo Verde.
Ding, 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 you got it.
Woo!
All right, and while we're doing this, if anyone has any questions that they've thought of, please throw it in the chat and we'll answer after this. Next up.
Let's see, that looks like it might be an agave.
Dudleya.
Yep, I was gonna say
Dudleya.
Dudleya.
I was gonna say, yeah, I think I
Yeah.
didn't have the scale.
Yeah,
on my
I should have put my
computer.
hand in there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Dudleya did cross my mind, but I was like,
This is pre-fire for everyone who doesn't know what they look like. So yeah,
Dudleyas are awesome.
they are.
They've got such
Love them.
great coloration.
And their flowers. Oh,
Yeah.
all right. So next one, got some regrowth.
That looks like jojoba.
Ding, ding,
Maybe?
ding. You got it. And one
I'm
more.
sure I look so nice as I get close up to my computer screen. My short-sightedness.
And the last one. Oh, I already gave you the answer.
Oh.
Sorry about that. So that is hedgehog cactus.
Yeah.
Which is
Aw.
really sad. So like Kara was saying, you know, those succulents, all of our cacti, you know, they are ones that really get drastically impacted by these fires.
There are some, and I believe Mammillaria is one genus that have shown some ability to recover after fire. But for the most part, yeah, many of our cacti are pretty hard hit by that.
All right. So it has been great having you here tonight, Kara. Thank you so much for talking with us about this really pressing and important topic. And I am popping links into the chat right now. And we have, the first one is for EcoFlora, for anyone that's interested in joining us. The second one is the Gila Watershed Partnership, where Kara is at.
Yes, and
and
we
then-
are out in Safford. So if anybody wants to come volunteer with us, please contact me if you want to come hang out with me, do some floristic work, get some experience with restoration. We have a bunkhouse available and accommodations. So if you want to come out for the weekend and hang out with me, you are more than welcome.
I didn't know that. That's awesome. Speaking from experience, Kara is fantastic to work with, so I highly encourage you take her up on that offer.
Aw, thanks.
I've also placed a link in the chat to an edition of the Plant Press, which is a publication from Arizona Native Plant Society, and Kara has an article in there on page 20, so you can read more from her about wildfire in the Sonoran. You can stay tuned with us in the Central Arizona Conservation Alliance this month as we talk about wildfire all month long. We have 2 more virtual events with wildfire experts in the coming weeks, and we'll be posting lots of great information on social media. Thank you so much again, Kara. Thank you all for tuning in tonight. If you'd like to know more, like I said, those links are in the chat. And if no one has any more questions, thank you again, and remember to live fire safe.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks everybody for coming.
Thanks a lot.